I think it's pretty well documented that I'm a big fan of Sean Baker. Few filmmakers working today have as clear and defined a mission statement as he does in destigmatizing sex work, and even fewer have the ability to weave their implicit, socially conscious messaging into what's first and foremost gripping narrative storytelling. He's a celluloid purist, but he understands practical limitations and is not afraid to experiment with different formats when circumstances demand, which he then utilizes for their unique image-making capabilities. Naturally, his films are guided by a strong stylistic hand, Baker involving himself heavily in their cinematography and editing them himself, but they're also ultimately character-driven. For all the atmospheric experimentation he engages in with Tangerine, for instance, it's these magnetic personalities that we're drawn to. He's earned his bones as a modern neo-realist, and his ability to dramatize heightened versions of his actors' lives and their communities at large is what's brought life to his independent filmmaking. Also responsible is Baker's wife and producing partner, Samantha Kwan. Again, so much of his style is dictated by the material conditions of his productions, and in a scenario where logistics translate so directly into aesthetic experience, I believe the role of the producer bears more authorship on the finished product here than in a more conventional dynamic. And when the director-producer duo is a married couple who no doubt bounce ideas off of each other, this line becomes especially smeared. Although Baker and Kwan have proven their mastery of using budgetary limitations to their advantage and finding uniquely expressive ideas within those parameters, as each film has gained more and more traction, they've so far managed to step up to the plate every time, not stifled or sanitized by the possibilities of budgetary inflation, but only enabled to develop their style even further. A film like Red Rocket, which operates with a much later polish and sophistication than an early work like Takeout, still retains the core humanity at the heart of his work, and rather than betraying that humanity with its theatrical prowess, somehow celebrates it even more. So their most high-profile film to date, the Palme d'Or winning Anora, has easily been one of my most anticipated films of the year, and certainly the one I went into this year's New York Film Festival most eager to see. The movie follows Mikey Madison as the titular Anora, or Annie by her own insistence, a stripper who, on a bender with a young client named Yvonne, or Vanya by his own insistence, ends up marrying into money. Like, a lot of money. Once they catch wind of the marriage, though, Vanya's Russian oligarch family immediately steps in to force an annulment, and Vanya runs away, leaving Annie to deal with the fallout by herself. In talking about the film's premise, one can't help but note the parallel between Annie's improved circumstances and the freedom a higher budget has unlocked for Baker. As Annie orders gratuitous room service and attends massages and lives this decadent high-roller lifestyle, Baker is afforded the opportunity to indulge all his stylistic desires. Just as money enables cosmetic improvements on the body, he has once again returned to his coveted 35mm film format, which, although still rich in texture, is actually quite clean by his standards. I can't find the exact figures, but The Hollywood Reporter states that the budget is at least slightly heftier than his other films, and you can feel the liberation. He's shot a feature on 35mm before, but even The Florida Project, which at $2 million was his highest budget until now, was forced, again by the material conditions of his production, to shoot the final scene on iPhone. As per usual, he found a thematic and stylistic justification for a practical decision there, but this is not a dilemma he finds himself in with Anora, and in that sense the film feels like both a victory lap and an introductory course to the idiosyncrasies he's developed throughout the years for his more newly initiated audience. He's been firmly settled into anamorphic photography for a while, even when shooting on iPhone or 16mm, so that comes as no surprise here, nor does the Aquafina font he's stuck with since Tangerine. He also maintains his ability to mine humor from deeply distressing and grounded situations here, his knack for location scouting, and related, various trademarks like featuring amusement parks or dessert shops in his films, which I'll talk more at length about later. The remix of Take That's Greatest Day as the unofficial theme song of Anora, which ushers us into the film at the start and then later reprises at a key emotional beat, serves the exact same purpose as Red Rocket's employment of NSYNC's Bye Bye Bye, repurposing garish pop with irony and sincerity in equal measure. And that speaks to his broader repurposing of the stylistic hallmarks of 70s exploitation cinema. This is where the mission statement comes into question. What does destigmatization really mean? And is it actually helpful to repurpose and sanitize the aesthetics of these films, which were made through and thus perpetuated notoriously misogynistic practices? The sex in Sean Baker's films is a largely communal affair. By Madison's account, he and Kwan literally act out the positions they want for a given scene to illustrate to the actors, which I think is a healthy level of freak for them, and there's even something sweet about this. While the film's ultimate gaze will always be up for debate, A man making a career out of women having sex on screen will always open himself up to some scrutiny, but I think if it weren't for the MPAA, he would portray other genders just as graphically. If nothing else, I'm sure he would showcase a lot more penises in his work, and, as is not exactly want of them. But as far as on-set exploitation is concerned, rather than all eyes on the naked actress othering her, by all available accounts, there is a sense that everybody is partaking in this ridiculous process together. And that inclusive mode of production is what I believe allows him to bridge the aesthetics of exploitation and destigmatization, all in service of his film's empathetic and judgment-free perspectives. All these stylistic and practical factors accumulate here into something that could only ever have come from the voice of Baker and Kwan. And it's the kind of film that exudes the infectious energy and fun the people making the film must have had on set. Madison is clearly devouring every line she's given with great charisma, and Mark Eidelstein as Vanya delivers the mannerisms of a 12-year-old in a 21-year-old's body to an uncanny degree. Also, I hate to say it, but a movie featuring Ivy Wolk, which at one point blasts Tatu's all the things she said, cannot beat the allegations of somewhat pandering to an online crowd, whether that's to provoke or to ingratiate. And I think with more eyes on him than ever, Baker's happy to do either. But despite the film's stylistic and thematic continuations, Anora marks some radical departures for Baker and company beyond just budget and visibility. And I think this boils down to the relationship in his films between the weather and his characters' lives. To understand this relationship, we have to look past Baker's focus on sex work as a subject matter, and understand it as one thematic interest under a broader umbrella. Since before this more concentrated focus, his work at large has studied the material conditions of people precariously scraping by under the radar of the legitimate workforce, be that as an undocumented delivery driver, as a bootlegger, as a dealer, as a scammer, or of course, as a sex worker. And is there a more crucial natural component to the material conditions of people whose work operates so far outside of the comforts of the establishment than the weather? Takeout would be half the movie it is without the persistent rain rendering the various deliveries that comprise most of the film's runtime a Sisyphean battle against the elements for lead character Ming, rendering every dismissive response he gets from a customer and the meager financial compensation for his work such devastating blows, and furthermore instilling into the notion that this is every day for him a sense of eternal damnation. This is the kind of expressive naturalism that Baker has always thrived on. After his Takeout follow-up Prince of Broadway, Baker left New York and began exclusively operating in warm areas, which is not so coincidentally when his focus on sex work began. While the heat doesn't contribute to this subject matter as much in something like The Florida Project, where it mainly plays into the kids' summer fun and escapism, the heat of Tangerine and Red Rocket serves a steamier purpose, and it gives those films a sense of urgency, either to Cindy's mission of finding Dinah or Mikey Saber's grind to get out of Texas City. There's also a more figurative warmth to his films, the kind of warmth generated by the spontaneity of people whose real, biographical, and fictional character traits are smeared beyond discernment, dropped into a dramatic situation and acting as exaggerations of themselves alongside each other. There's always a strong camaraderie in these films among people living in similar circumstances who respond to the world by laughing at it together. A prime example from Tangerine is in the club when Cindy and Dinah drop their rivalry, which up to this point has generated all the tension and momentum in the story, and smoke meth in the bathroom together. This is also what Baker accomplishes in long stretches of Takeout, halting what little narrative there is to cycle us through a bunch of real people who are regulars at this shop, seemingly actually ordering food for real. This sense of community is fostered by Baker's interest in theme parks and dessert shops, places where a wide variety of people gather. This is where Baker's neo-realist roots really flourish, in these eclectic locations packed with real people whose energy Baker has a generational talent for sniffing out. These spots, which have taken on a mythological quality in his work, provide a smorgasbord of subjects for him to study. Theme parks also bear an architectural wonkiness consistent with Baker's cinematography, crash zooms and awkward angles and unrelenting kineticism, while being garish displays of capitalist excess. And dessert shops, and particularly donut shops, display the ironic, over-the-top sweetness of his films, often serving as the sexual punchline to his film's underlying, and very often overlying, libidos. So just to be extra clear, we have weather conditions, including literal warmth, we have figurative warmth and camaraderie of real people, and these third places like dessert shops and theme parks, all wrapped up together full circle like a donut. This has been the Sean Baker tradition. Anora carries this torch, and we watch the flame immediately frost over. This return to New York is the coldest film in Baker's entire catalog. It snows about as many times in this movie as it does in an average winter in New York, which is to say like 3 times. The warm camaraderie I discussed comes here in the form of the strip club, which Annie completely abandons once she marries Vanya, seduced by the life of riches, and there's a marriage of form and function here, of the cold weather conditions expressing this world not only being a false promise to her, but fundamentally empty at its core, even for the people who genuinely live it. Instead of the intimate and communally shared spaces his previous subjects inhabit, we spend much of this film in a massive, empty mansion. The gaudiness of this Russian oligarch's Long Island estate is overcompensating for the lack of connection among the family, and the transactional nature of every relationship when you reach that level of status. This lack of connection is doubled when Vanya abandons Annie, and she's left to deal with the heavies his dad has orchestrating their divorce. So the cold absence of people, of life in Anora, in part speaks to the vapidness of this rich lifestyle that's new for Baker's subject matter. But it's also ultimately an extension of the working class alienation found at the heart of all of his films. I'm reminded of yet another scene from Takeout, in which all of the employees are discussing their debts and bonding over a common struggle, and Ming can't even take part in this one reprieve because his debts are so much worse, having subsumed higher interest debts to pay off his family. Conversely, Annie can no longer relate to her coworkers at the club because she's fallen into this heap of money. But she also can't relate to the people in Vanya's life because she's not actually a member of this upper crust. Not only has she superficially married her way in, but unbeknownst to her, the marriage as a whole is really just an extension of Vanya's bender, and what she naively views as spontaneous love is actually nothing more than extended roleplay for him that he continues to pay for. So she finds herself in this liminal space that only the cold winter night can externalize. And as far as the third places like theme parks and dessert shops are concerned, as the Tangerine-esque manhunt for Vanya that takes up most of the film's second half brings us to Coney Island, we are confronted with a seasonally closed theme park that is literally frigid and, for both literal and thematic reasons, completely devoid of people. Inexplicably, the ice cream shop is still open, though nobody really goes in there except for Annie because her friends work there. The important point here is that in the world of Anora, even the dessert is cold. This is an emotional tundra from every angle. I appreciate the ideas at play here. They're in service of a film that is itself a roller coaster with a pretty significant structural rise and drop, and I think the cold works to preserve a sense of unease that can easily be forgotten amid the film's more comedic hijinks, which I would argue eventually do take precedence. By the end, though, it becomes pretty important to keep the unease alive in some capacity, and I'll get more into that later. I also think, however, that there are some drawbacks to this approach that back the film into certain corners Baker hasn't experienced before. For one, as much as I admire the formal gambit of alienating us in the cold like the film does, again, it makes thematic sense, I don't think we properly experience enough warmth at the start to truly feel the contrast. More specifically, I think Annie's normal world feels uncharacteristically unlived in for Baker. The benefit of neorealism is the irrefutable fact that real people are inherently interesting and compelling, and by transposing their behavior into a film and meandering away from the leads to focus on them, you are instantly coloring the background with depth and suggesting a world beyond who our narrative framework clings to. Annie's co-workers, who are as authentically cast as in any of Baker's films, are not quite paid the same attention and thus don't convey the same dimension. The majority of the strip club stuff consists of the rivalry between Annie and Diamond in a feud where narrative priorities seem to eclipse character. There are personalities in the club, Diamond of course, Annie's friend Lulu, her boss Nick, and Red Rocket alum Brittany Rodriguez as Dawn. Her character's lack of depth compared to her previous character with pretty comparable screen time illustrates how less developed these characters are at large. And when we return to the club later in the film, we're so focused on Vanya that we can't really process whatever disconnect Annie may feel from her old world. For the first time, it feels like the ensemble of workers here really is nothing more than background decoration. Even worse is our glimpse into Annie's home life, with a sister who gets maybe 2 lines. I get that these arenas are not the focus of the film, and I may be putting too much stock in them for the sake of argument here, but I do think Baker seems to be less curious about these ecosystems and the people who inhabit them than he's been in the past. And I think as the branching off point from which Annie leaves, it's especially important to thoroughly drive the warmth and camaraderie home. As is, I find it a little surprising that these working class perspectives are largely pushed to the margins here. In theory, this shouldn't be an issue because Annie is the voice of the people, and as we follow her, she preserves this grounded ethos so that as we become fully entrenched in the cold world of Vanya's extended family and lack of Vanya, there is still some warmth to cling to, some humanity to foil the dehumanization. For her outsized personality, though, and for Mikey Madison's commitment to the role, I still find there to be something a little hollow here. To discuss the issue I believe is the root cause here, I want to be very careful. I think Madison is a great actor who delivers a great performance with the material given, and the material isn't bad either. But I think the issue here is the very nature of going about this more traditional casting of a celebrity for the role, given Baker's prior MO. Madison is notably the first Hollywood star to lead a Sean Baker film. The most high-profile talent he's worked with in the past was Willem Dafoe, naturally so far the only Oscar-nominated performance in Baker's filmography, but he plays second fiddle to a series of non-actors who still anchor that film. And though I think he gives a very human performance as well, it wouldn't feel as authentic if he were the leading man. Even Simon Rex, who was a celebrity before Red Rocket, not only had experienced a bit of a career decline prior to being cast, but his lived experience closely mirrored the backstory of the character he was playing, to the point where Baker was once again able to smear those details of reality and fiction. Madison isn't exactly an A-lister, but she's not far out. Ironically, this might be the film to make it happen with the Oscar buzz it's getting. But this practice as a whole renders the material, to a certain degree, unable to take on the life of his previous films. And more than ever, you feel a barrier between the cast and the dialogue. I think Baker is straining at times in a way he hasn't had to in the past, to write dialogue for a voice he doesn't really know, and the net result sounds a bit too Scorsese affectation-y for my taste. Gone are the monologues about the expressive possibilities of shaping the spit glob in a blowjob scene, or analyzing a sex tape like a sports commenter analyzing game footage from Red Rocket, which is so clearly an instance of Baker the fan and Rex the performer speaking a common tongue. It feels more like Baker is shooting in the dark with his writing, and his talented cast can only do so much to elevate the dialogue. This is another point that stems from the casting of more traditional actors, where Baker's workflow as in the past more closely resembled that of a band leader who can conduct great improvisation. He's tasking himself more and more with traditional composing, and I think for the first time he's officially ever so slightly out of his depth. This is especially pronounced once Vanya dips out of the film, and the pacing not only comes to a standstill, but the entire narrative mode seems to take on the logic of a Three Stooges special. Structurally, this is supposed to be the wake-up call, reality smacking Annie in the face. But actually, this is when the film burrows itself into slapstick farce. While everyone and their mother's trying to determine which Safdie film this most resembles, I've maintained that its closest brethren is the Sopranos episode Pine Barrens. The net result is something that feels overtly like a comedy, despite not really being one. And Baker's always achieved an incredible balance between humor and bleak realities, but the likes of Tangerine and Red Rocket, which are both outwardly funnier films than this, also strike a better balance in my opinion. Anora seemingly can't decide if it wants to pull the rug out from under us midway through, or sustain the artifice until the very end. And the result is like pulling the rug out from under us, only to reveal a second rug underneath. The final scene is a bit of a redemption though, which I believe retroactively justifies some of the wonkiness in the middle. This depends on another departure for Baker. He has an affinity for subjective, imaginary endings, be them escapist in nature like the fantasy of the Florida Project and delusion of Red Rocket, or bleak and ambiguous like Takeout's delirious bike ride through nighttime traffic. Even Tangerine, which ends more or less matter-of-factly after the events of the story, sees the two leads humoring themselves and finding some light in the darkness, some sense of joviality amid the bleak. Anora does the opposite. When Vanya leaves, an arc with one of the handlers, Igor, begins. At the very end, after Annie's been dragged through the muck and dehumanized and essentially told that she is a commodity, Igor does one good thing to try and make it up to her, which triggers the automatic transactional response that Annie tries to initiate sex with him. But as soon as he tries to kiss her and make this something more intimate than it is, the sudden reality of everything that's happened catches up to her, and she breaks down, snow falling around her, and the movie ends. In other words, the film ends with her coming to, rather than burrowing into fantasy. From this perspective, the entire film could be viewed as a complete inversion of Baker's framework, and for the first time, he is explicitly pointing to the victimhood and consequences of a system that leads people into sex work, rather than operating in the micro with his ground-level character studies for us to make our own moral assessments. This makes clearer than ever the intent I discussed earlier behind his appropriation of exploitation aesthetics, and though I think the aspects of his work he trades off to come to this conclusion are not entirely made up for in this different mode for him, and for a number of reasons I didn't have quite the personal connection to this as I do to films like Red Rocket or Tangerine, I can't deny that this is a significant moment in his work. I also find that I back myself into corners when talking about Sean Baker's movies, even though I love everything I've seen so much. I made this Letterboxd post when I first saw Tangerine in 2018, thinking at the time it was more a term of endearment than it really is. I began my Florida Project review with a 4-minute rant against Orlando that at the time I thought was just an extended bit directed at an easy target, but which I see now is the product of a privileged and self-loathing Floridian, months out of high school, experiencing life outside of Florida for the first time, directing his pent-up aggression towards the people of Orlando rather than the broader infrastructural issues caused by the theme park economy, because he had no perspective on the world. It's not possible to issue a correction on YouTube, but I've genuinely lost sleep over this video, and I'd just like to redirect my frustrations with the Orlando Kissimmee area towards Mr. Walt Disney himself and the corporate monstrosity he created. And now here I am, talking about a movie I liked for the most part, and I can't help but overshadow my appreciation of it by emphasizing what I disliked about it. Maybe that says more about me than Sean Baker or Samantha Kwan, but you know what? That's a problem for another day. That's it from me this time around on Anora. You can find my links in the description. You can go check out Patreon, where you will find a number of exclusive videos, reviews, podcast-style recaps of everything I've watched in a given month. You will be able to see a much more comprehensive look at my experience at the New York Film Festival this year. That is all waiting for you on Patreon, as well as my other socials, Letterboxd, Twitter, Instagram. Do what you will, like, share, comment, subscribe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.